Have you ever heard of a crochet rule? Somebody told you that you have to do something a specific way, or you read something that you have to do it a specific way, or you learned something on YouTube or in a class or something that said you have to do something a certain way. These crochet rules, while some of them I think are very respectable and I follow, and I think others should follow as well, there are a few of these crochet rules that I break on purpose, and a lot of times my projects turn out a little bit better for it. So today I want to share 6 crochet rules that I break on purpose and why you might want to break them as well. Okay, first up, blocking. Now look, I'll be the first one to preach and to tell you all day long that blocking your projects is generally a good thing. It generally makes your projects look better. But I'll be honest, I don't always block my projects. And that's okay. Sometimes they look perfectly fine and I'm perfectly happy with it. In the cases where I crochet a scarf, or I crochet a shawl perhaps, if I crochet a garment, a sweater, a top, or something that I'm gonna wear, I always block those because I feel like that's a pretty good practice to get into. It's a great way to settle the stitches, make it look right, and especially in the case for garments, you can block to your exact size, and a lot of patterns will instruct you to do that. So blocking in some circumstances, I would say, is kind of a must, and it's something that I always do. But for other projects, like blankets, hats, I don't always block. I do sometimes. I typically block my knit hats more than I block my crochet hats. Headbands, wrist warmers, gloves, socks, crochet socks. I've got a really cool pattern for a pair of crochet socks. I'll link them in the description below. I didn't block those. You don't really have to. They actually turn out perfect without it. So for me, blocking a blanket, the reason why I typically don't do that as often, or kind of not at all, is they're just so big. You have to have a nice big blocking surface, something that you can pin to, and something that, is totally fine to get a little bit of moisture on it. And yeah, I just don't always want to go through that trouble with a blanket. I might for a baby blanket because they're smaller and I can piece my blocking boards together so that it will fit on the blocking board. But for like throws that I make for our house, I am not blocking those. Other items that when you put them on or that you wear and they stretch quite a bit when you're wearing them, those are the other instances where I tend not to block those projects. So headbands certainly fit into that category. Hats also fit into that category. That's where like the gloves and the hand warmers, mittens, socks, slippers, things like that, that when you put them on, like they have negative ease built into them, so they're a little bit smaller before you put them on, and then they stretch a little bit as you wear them, and that extra stretch sort of adds to their function. It's in those instances where I just save my time and I don't typically block those projects. Now, if I'm gifting something to somebody, or if I'm going to sell one of my projects, which I don't often do, like rarely ever will I do that, but in those instances, I would take the extra time because yes, I do think it looks a little bit better. Yes, I do think it's nice to allow your yarn to relax. And yeah, I really do like to sort of condition the yarn and clean it up with a little bit of wool wash. But blocking, I think, is one of those crochet rules that you can be a little bit flexible with. If blocking is a new concept to you, if you've never heard of it before, I do have a really helpful post on my website that you can read through. It talks about what blocking is, why you might want to do it, when you might want to really consider blocking, and the different methods that you can do so. I'll have that linked in the description below if you want to give that a try or a read. I think it's definitely worth your time. Rule number 2, and this is going to be a pretty controversial one, gauge swatching. Now look, I will always tell you that making a gauge swatch is a good idea. And I think it's a concept and a technique and a practice that you should not only get familiar with, but get pretty good at. Because gauge and gauge swatching is incredibly important when you make projects where size is important. If you're ever going to knit a sweater or knit a top or a pair of shorts or anything that you're going to wear and follow a pattern, you pretty much have to gauge swatch. So that is one of the rules that I tend to not break, and it is a rule that I don't think you should break either. Because if your stitches are measuring different than the pattern, then no matter if you follow the pattern to a T, if your stitches are a different size, your finished project will be a different size, and then you've invested a lot of time and yarn into a finished project that may not fit you the way you want it to fit you. So gauge swatching, when size is important, that's when you don't want to break this rule, at least in my opinion. When I think you can get away with breaking this rule is for projects where the sizing isn't critically important. So for me, this means typically blankets. Now, there are some other things like nuances that might come into play if you don't gauge swatch for something like a blanket, because not only does gauge give you an idea of the size comparison of your stitches to, say, the designer who made the pattern that you're working off of, but also the yarn requirements for it. And for a blanket, that could get kind of tricky. If you're ordering yarn online, you maybe don't want to order a bunch extra. You're ordering just what the pattern tells you. And if your stitches are bigger, then you're using more yarn, then you're not going to have enough yarn to finish. So gauge swatching is, I told you, it's going to be a tough one because it's important, but you can be flexible. So I personally don't gauge swatch typically for blankets, especially if I have worked off of a designer before and I know that my tension, my stitch size, matches that designer's, and I don't usually have to tinker with or change the hook size to meet the gauge. But you know, there are other projects where obviously size isn't super important, where you don't have as much time and yarn invested into it as a blanket. And for me, this is home decor items. If I'm crocheting something for, like, you know, a pillow cover or a placemat or a basket or something like that, anything that I would put in my home that doesn't require a lot of yarn and that it doesn't really matter if it's a tiny bit bigger or a tiny bit smaller, those are the instances where I definitely just kind of skip the gauging part altogether. Now, if your pattern is similar to this one and has you crochet a few rounds, for instance, and measure those rounds, I'll go through the extra effort to make the measurements and make sure I'm on the right track. I'll adjust hook sizes if I need to. And again, I think these are good practices to get into. But you know, if you're going to challenge the you must swatch every time rule, then I think there are some instances where you can definitely get away with it. And there are definitely some instances where I don't even want to try to get away with it. So again, this will be one of those rules, I think, that it's polarizing. You're either very much for this rule or you're maybe very much against it. I typically like to sit somewhere in the middle. I like to allow myself some flexibility when I know that I can make an educated decision to do that. But I would say, as a general rule of thumb, if you're not sure, it's always best to gauge swatch. But if you've been doing this for a while and you're a little bit more comfortable with what gauge is, what gauge means, and when you can be a little bit more flexible with this rule, then yeah, I think there are instances when you can get a little bit flexible with it. Now, if gauge is a completely new topic to you, if you're just hearing about this for the first time, or if you're just not like really familiar or really comfortable with it yet to make that decision of yes, I can be flexible or no, I can't be flexible, then check out the description below. I've got a resource on my website, just a full post that tells you all about gauge swatching, why you want to do it, why it's so important, how to do it, and yeah, in those instances where you could potentially be a little bit flexible. So I'll have that linked in the description below. Definitely worth a read if you have the extra time. Rule number 3 that I often break, and this one is not always on purpose, if we're being honest, and that's you have to leave at least a 6-inch tail to weave in your tails. I don't know what it is. When I'm working quickly, really excited to start a project, I'll make my slip knot, and I just don't measure my tail, and I don't really check to see if it's long enough in some instances. Sometimes I'm left with a pretty short tail, and then I have to get creative about how I weave that in later on. So first of all, why you might want to do this is because, well, the longer the tail, the more you can weave it in, then the more secure the tail is, and it maybe won't weave itself out later on with, washing or wearing or use of that project. And I always do find that when I adhere to this rule and I leave myself at least 6 inches, I never regret it. I never look back and say, darn, I wish I made that tail a little bit shorter because I could have woven it in or weaved, whatever. I could have taken a little shortcut and not put so much effort into weaving the tail in. I always find that if I weave it in a little bit more, then it works out a lot better. I also find that even if your tail is a little bit shorter, if you sort of get sloppy with how you're weaving it in and you split the yarn and the fibers as you're weaving the tail in, this is one of my best tips for weaving it in so that it stays together, because the yarn likes to stick to itself, especially if you have woven it into the plies or into the twist of the yarn. I have a video that I'll link to in the description as well, where I have several tips for weaving in your ends so that they stay put, if that's something that you're really struggling with. But, I think this is one of those rules that if you can potentially avoid it, I try to, but I don't always leave myself a long enough tail, and it's usually not by choice. So in those instances, don't worry if you don't have a long enough tail, if it doesn't meet this requirement or this rule. There are things that you can do so that you can weave them in so that they still stay put as if you had a really long tail to weave in. Nowadays, I take an even different shortcut. I would say for the last probably 2 years now, I have been using a little technique or trick or whatever you want to call it, called the magic knot. And this is, again, is one of those polarizing topics because I know a lot of you watching love this technique, and I know a lot of you hate this technique. It's all personal preference. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, if you're not comfortable with it. But for me, it's never failed me. So I feel very comfortable with the magic knot until I get to the point where it does fail me. And then my opinion might change completely. But essentially, the magic knot is a way that you can fasten your yarn together. So that way, when it's pulled, like when you're pulling on the 2 knots, it just reinforces it. And it really is just very sturdy. I've got a tutorial on how you do that. It's super quick and easy. It's worth a watch, I think, if you hate weaving in ends and you don't mind a knot in your project. If you hate those ideas, if you hate the fact that there would be a knot in your project, then yeah, this technique probably isn't for you, but it is an option if you hate weaving in ends and you want to just break this rule altogether. Because typically if I'm breaking this rule, it's because 1, I didn't think to leave myself a long enough tail, or I'm using the magic knot because I just can't bear the thought of weaving in a ton of ends. Rule number 4, don't mix yarn weights or fibers or textures. I think personally, for me, this rule was meant to be broken. There was a long period of time where I did not break this rule. If I was working on a project, specifically blankets, typically, because I may not have bought 15 skeins of one particular yarn, but I maybe have 15 skeins of the same yarn weight in several different brands or yarns or colors or whatever. I was very much afraid to mix and match yarn brands, especially, textures even more so, and fibers, just by principle. But as I got more familiar with different yarns and how they behave after they've been used for a while, different brands, as I've gotten more comfortable with just substituting yarns in general, I found myself breaking this rule quite a bit, actually. And nowadays there's even yarns that completely break this rule within the same skein. I don't know if you've seen it. I want to say it's It's a Bernat yarn. If I can find it, I will link it in the description below, or I'll show it on the screen here, where these yarns have different textures built into it, and they look so cool. Like projects that you can make with yarns that have different textures, it just brings in a completely new element and just level of creativity for me. It makes me really excited about starting a new project because I'm very eager to see how yarns work up together, and like specifically these yarns where that's, you know, several textures into one. Now with all of these rules and how we're breaking them, there are a couple of caveats to them. So one, if I'm mixing and matching my yarns, I'm typically doing so because I'm pulling from my stash. That's one of the goals that I've had this year. I've got lots of skeins of yarn where I just have maybe one or two, and I don't have like enough to make a bigger project. And so I don't have to just crochet hats or, you know, like smaller things to use up those yarns. I like to mix and match them. So that might be one instance of why you would want to mix and match fibers. Others would be like we talked about before, just creativity and like fun and just trying something new and completely different. So there are a couple of things to keep in mind if you're going to break this crochet rule, and that is keeping like fibers together as much as you can because of the care instructions. So I have a lot of acrylic yarns and I have a lot of wool yarns. And I'm not saying you can't mix an acrylic yarn with a wool yarn in the same project, but think about how that project is going to be used, worn, and laundered. So if you're making a blanket, for instance, especially like say a baby blanket, something you know you're going to wash a lot or would get a lot of washing and use, you would want all of the fibers in that blanket, in that one project, to have similar care instructions, because some acrylic yarns are washer dryer friendly. Some wool yarns are washer friendly, but not dryer friendly. Some acrylic yarns you can't put in the washer, and I mean, it could be any combination of these things. So if you know the project that you're making needs to be washer dryer friendly, then make sure all of the yarns that you're putting into that project are also washer dryer friendly. Rule number 5, and I definitely break this one. You have to work on just one project at a time and finish it before you can start another one. Now, I have never been one to take this advice or to follow this rule whatsoever, because for me, variety is the spice of life. I love to have projects of all sorts going at any given time. Different textures, different yarns, different moods, different themes. This is what keeps me excited about crocheting and keeps me going back. If I'm working on one big project where I can sit down for, you know, a couple of hours at a time and I don't see a lot of progress at the end of all that work, there is nothing more unmotivating than that. I can't tell you how many blankets that I currently have in my WIP pile, works in progress pile, that are partially finished just because I'm not seeing enough progress on them. And then they sort of just migrated to a space in my closet that I don't typically see very often. I usually remedy that by mixing in smaller projects, and I need that in order to finish those bigger ones. So the instant win is a big driver and motivator for me to finish so many projects with the amount of time that I have to crochet. So embrace the WIPs, embrace the works in progress. If you have 10, 20 projects going at once, don't beat yourself up over that. Don't be ashamed about that, because as long as you're doing some amount of work on each one of those projects, they're fueling each other. They're helping you stay motivated to finish and work on some. Rule number 6, using only the hook size that's given in your pattern. This is one of those instances where, again, it plays back into gauge and understanding tension and the sizing of your stitches and how that works into the pattern and that sort of thing. So if gauge is an unfamiliar topic for you, remember that post in the description below about gauge, I think is very much worth your time to look into because gauge is a very important topic. So this particular rule is very much intertwined with gauge. And, you know, I'll be honest, when I was new and starting patterns and hadn't really finished a lot of patterns, I thought the hook size is the hook size and that's what you use. And if your gauge didn't match, then I was doing something wrong. Like I was crocheting wrong or something like that. And that couldn't be further from the truth. This is one of those rules that is actually meant to be broken. The hook size in the pattern is more of a guideline. The thing that's not a guideline, like the thing that is the surefire thing that you have to adhere to in a pattern is the gauge. So the hook size determines the size of your stitches, right? That's kind of what we understand, what we're taught. But the other thing that plays into that is your individual crochet style. Think about our handwriting, for instance. We all use the same letters. We can all write the exact same word, but it would look different for every single person. So stitching is very much like our handwriting. We're doing the same stitches, but we're doing so in our own unique little style. And our style and how we make stitches is where the variability comes from. And that's why you might have followed a pattern in the past using the exact hook size that was given, and maybe your gauge didn't match. Maybe your stitches were bigger, maybe your stitches were smaller. No matter what the outcome, if it was different than the pattern, then it was probably because your stitches are made just a tiny bit different, your unique style, than the designer who created that pattern. So if you've ever been told, or if you have the idea in your head like I did, that you have to use the exact hook size that's given in your pattern, this is one of those rules that you should comfortably break if your gauge doesn't match. Now, if that's not the case, maybe you just don't have the hook size that it recommends, and that's why you're changing hook sizes, I would suggest you not do that, and perhaps try to get the right crochet hook size, unless you have crocheted a gauge swatch and you matched the gauge with the hook size that you have. So that's the caveat that floats around this particular rule. You can change the hook size that is suggested in your pattern, but only if you have matched your gauge with that crochet hook size that you want to use. So while these rules can be helpful, they certainly don't have to run the show. At the end of the day, if you're doing what you do and your projects are turning out great and you're happy with them and you're proud of the things that you're making, then you're doing the right thing. But if you find yourself maybe challenging or questioning a couple of the things that you might have heard that you should be doing with your projects, I'd say it's okay to challenge that a little bit. I think that only stands to help us creatively to make projects that are potentially more interesting or more fun or something that you enjoy better, which is the main reason. You're crocheting for you. You're crocheting for your loved ones. You're doing it for your hobby, for your mental well-being. You're doing this because it's fun. And sometimes following a lot of rules isn't always really fun. So if you come across a rule or somebody tells you you have to do something a certain way, I'd say the first thing is to ask why. Understand why that rule is important to somebody else and why it might be important to you. And if you can look at that and say, well, I could do it that way, but I could also do this, and I would have an outcome that I would still be happy with. Those are the instances where I say it's perfectly fine to break some crochet rules. Now, I know I can't be the only one, right, who breaks a couple of these rules. So if there is a rule in crochet that you typically break on a regular basis, leave those in the comments below. I'm really excited to read those and to see what other types of things that you like to do for your projects, those rules that you like to break, and how you have creatively challenge those rules to do something else. Leave that in the comments section below. I can't wait to read that. Happy hooking, and I'll see you in the next one.